I refused to cancel my interview just to drive my brother to his girlfriend's house. My dad snapped, "His future matters, not yours." I looked at him and said, "You really meant it." Then walked out and never came back. I'm living in Midland, Texas, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. Oil country, flat as a pancake, hot as 9 months out of the year, and full of people who either struck it rich or are grinding through the dust trying to survive. Guess which category I fell into? I was still living in my parents' house at the time of this little incident, not because I wanted to. Trust me, I'd rather have bunked in a storage unit behind the Walmart. But after high school, I'd bounced between warehouse gigs and delivery jobs, trying to save enough to get out while paying $350 a month in rent to my own parents. Yeah, you read that right. They charged me rent starting the day I turned 18. Happy birthday, son. Here's your invoice. The cake is extra. My younger brother Weston, 22, had never paid a dime, never worked a real job either. He was in his 4th year of a 2-year business degree at the community college, somehow still on the family payroll, driving a truck that cost more than I'd made in the past 2 years combined. Our parents called him entrepreneurial. I called him a professional mooch with a nice smile, but what do I know? The favoritism wasn't subtle. When Weston needed spending money, it showed up out of nowhere. When I needed help with literally anything, there was always a reason it couldn't happen. Tight month, unexpected expense, the truck needs repairs. You understand, Colt? You were the responsible one. Responsible. That's code for the one we don't have to worry about because he'll figure it out himself while we focus on the kid who can't tie his shoes without supervision. I understood, all right. I understood I was the family workhorse, the one who only got acknowledged when something needed lifting or fixing or covering for. Case in point, my toolbox. I'd spent years buying tools piece by piece with warehouse paychecks. Weston borrowed them constantly, never asked, just took whatever he needed and left the rest scattered across the garage. Half came back broken, or not at all. When I complained, my mother told me to stop being selfish. Family shares. Funny how sharing only went one direction. Then I caught a break. Garrett Mechanical, one of the biggest HVAC outfits in the Permian Basin, was taking apprenticeship applications. Real deal stuff. Paid training certifications and a real ladder to journeyman. The kind of opportunity that could actually turn into a career instead of just another job that paid minimum wage and went nowhere. I spent 2 weeks on that application, got a reference from my supervisor at the warehouse, a guy named Dale, who'd been in the trades for 30 years before his back gave out. Dale was good people, told me exactly what to say, how to present myself, what questions to expect. Even let me borrow his truck to drive to the interview since my own vehicle was held together by rust and duct tape. The night before the interview, I was in the kitchen ironing my one decent button-down when I heard my parents talking in the living room. Wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but sound carries in a single-story ranch house. Weston needs another $800 for this semester, registration fees or something. Didn't we already cover that last month? We did. There were some extra costs. Extra costs? Right. I'd seen Weston's extra costs. New gaming setup, weekend trips with his girlfriend, the kind of expenses that showed up whenever his bank account got low, which was basically always. But here's the part that really got me, my mother's response. It's fine. We'll pull from the education fund. Education fund? I stood there holding a hot iron, feeling like someone had just told me the sky was green, and I'd been told since I was 16 that there was no money for my education. That's why I hadn't gone to college. That's why I'd been grinding through dead-end jobs while Weston floated through life on a cloud of parental subsidies. That's why I was 26 and still living in a house where I paid rent to sleep in the smallest bedroom. There was an education fund. It just wasn't for me. I finished ironing my shirt in silence, went to bed, stared at the ceiling until 4 o'clock in the morning, doing math I should have done years ago. Every time I'd been told no, every opportunity I'd watched walk past because we couldn't afford it, every sacrifice I'd made while my brother collected participation trophies for just existing. The interview wasn't just an opportunity anymore. It was proof that I could build something without them. And apparently, that scared the hell out of somebody. Morning came too fast. I was up at 6 to be. I showered, dressed, running through interview scenarios in my head while trying to eat toast without getting crumbs on my shirt. The apprenticeship started at 8 per week a week during training, with a bump to $1,200 once you pass your first certification. Benefit stability, A future that didn't involve wondering if my truck would start or if the engine would finally give up and leave me stranded on the side of Highway 20. Weston rolled out of bed around 9:30. Most days he didn't surface until noon. He was wearing basketball shorts and a shirt that probably cost more than my entire outfit. Made himself a bowl of cereal, the expensive organic stuff my parents bought specifically for him because regular cereal apparently wasn't good enough him. Sat down at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone like the world owed him entertainment. "Hey, I need you to drive me to Kennedy's place." Kennedy was his girlfriend. He lived about 20 minutes outside of town on her family's property. Nice girl, way too good for him. But that's not my business. I checked my watch. My interview was at 11 a.m. I had to leave by 10 early to make sure I had buffer time because you don't show up to a potential career opportunity running hot and sweaty because you cut it too close. First impressions matter, and showing up flustered tells them you can't manage your time. Can't. Got an interview at 11. Okay. He didn't even look up from his phone. So reschedule. Kennedy and I have plans. I've been waiting 3 months for this interview. And I've been waiting to see my girlfriend. Take the bus or something. I don't know. I told him no. That was apparently the wrong answer. Weston wasn't used to hearing that word, especially not from me. His whole life had been built around the assumption that other people would work around him. He left the kitchen without another word. I heard him talking to my mother in the hallway, the entitled tone of someone who'd never been told no in his life and didn't know how to handle it. Within 5 minutes, she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, face set in that disappointed expression she'd perfected over the years. "Colt, why can't you just help your brother this once?" This once. Like I hadn't spent the last 26 years being the family's free help. Like I hadn't rearranged my schedule, sacrificed my plans, and bent over backward 1,000 times so the golden child could do whatever he wanted. You know how important Kennedy is to him. And this interview is important for me. Why does his thing automatically win? Because family supports each other. Colt, when's the last time anyone in this family supported me? She didn't have an answer for that, just pressed her lips together and gave me that look, the one that said I was being difficult on purpose. I stood my ground, told her I was going to this interview no matter what. Weston could figure out his own transportation like an adult, or he could wait until someone else was available. That's when my father came home early. He'd supposedly been at a job site across town, but he was back by 10 or so, which meant my mother had called him. He found me in my room doing a final check of my documents. I had my application printed out, a copy of my certifications, Dale's reference letter, everything organized in a folder, ready to show them I was serious. "Your mother says you're refusing to help your brother." "I have interview in an hour, an important one." "Weston has commitments too." I looked at him, tried to see if there was any self-awareness there, any recognition of how insane that statement was. Found nothing, just the same flat certainty he'd always had, the belief that whatever he decided was automatically correct. Driving to his girlfriend's house isn't a commitment, it's a convenience. We argued. He pulled out the greatest hits, ungrateful, selfish, too big for your britches. I made the mistake of mentioning the education fund I'd overheard them discussing, the one that apparently existed for Weston, but had been a ghost story my whole life, the one that supposedly couldn't afford to help me with trade school, but could cover Weston's 4th year of community college. Something shifted in his expression. "You remember that certification test 2 years ago, your truck breaking down?" I remembered. I'd been devastated. Sat on the side of the road for 3 hours waiting for a tow, while my phone died, watching my appointment time come and go. Called the testing center from Dale's phone later, tried to reschedule, but they'd given my spot away. The registration fee was non-refundable, set me back $400 I didn't have. Fuel pumps real easy to disconnect, real easy to reconnect too, once you're not needed anymore. The words registered slowly. He'd sabotaged my truck. My own father had deliberately destroyed my chance at a certification so Weston could go party with his friends at a lake house. Family comes first, Colt. When are you going to learn that? Something went very quiet inside me, like clarity, the kind that comes when you've been looking at a puzzle for years, and suddenly all the pieces click into place. I told him I was going to my interview, moved toward the door. That's when he grabbed me by the shirt and introduced me to the wall. My mother appeared in the hallway. She covered her mouth, but didn't move, didn't say anything, didn't do a single thing to stop it. Weston was behind her with this smug little expression, arms crossed, watching like he was enjoying the show. I pushed my father's hands off me, looked at him for a long moment, memorized his face, the satisfaction in his eyes, the complete absence of regret. My mother finally found her voice. "Colt, he didn't mean—" "Yeah, he did." I picked up my folder of documents from where it had fallen and walked out the front door. I made it to the parking lot of a gas station about 3 miles from my parents' house before my hands started shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by this weird mix of anger and something that might have been relief, like I'd been waiting for permission to leave, and my father had finally given it to me in the most messed up way possible. The bathroom mirror showed a red mark blooming along my cheekbone where I'd hit the wall. My shirt was wrinkled from where he'd grabbed it. I had about 40 minutes to pull myself together and show up to the most important interview of my life. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of my face, texted it to Dale with one line. If something happens to me, it was my father. Then I did what I could, splashed water on my face, tucked my shirt back in, ran wet fingers through my hair. The mark on my face was getting darker by the minute, heading toward a nice purple bruise that would be impossible to hide or explain away. I wasn't going to hide. It wasn't going to make up some story about walking into a door or tripping over something. If they asked, I'd tell the truth. If that cost me the opportunity, at least I'd know what kind of company I was dealing with. Garrett Mechanical was headquartered in a corrugated metal building on the east side of town. Practical, built to survive West Texas weather. I arrived 12 minutes early, checked in with a receptionist who gave my face a concerned look and waited. The guy who came out to get me was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a handshake like a vice grip, introduced himself as Ray Thornton, operations manager. He'd been with the company since he was 19, worked his way up from apprentice to running the whole show. The first thing he noticed was the bruise. Hard to miss at that point. "Rough morning." I could have lied, but I was just tired of pretending. My father threw me against a wall because I wouldn't cancel this interview to drive my brother to his girlfriend's house. Ray's eyebrows went up. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "How far did you drive to get here after that?" "About 10 miles. Stopped at a gas station to fix my shirt." He made this sound somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. "Come on back. Let's talk." The interview went well. Ray asked about my experience, my goals, why I wanted to get into HVAC specifically. I told him the truth. I'd been grinding through nowhere jobs for years, watching opportunities slip past because I couldn't afford them or didn't have the connections. I wanted to build something real, something that was mine, something nobody could take away from me. Why HVAC? Why not just find another warehouse gig? Because warehouse gigs don't go anywhere. I've watched guys do that for 20 years and end up exactly where they started. I want to actually build something. Most kids your age just want the paycheck, don't want to hear about the grind. I've been grinding my whole life. Might as well grind towards something that matters. He told me about his own path. Started as a helper at 19, learned the trade from the ground up, eventually bought into the company as a partner. Said he'd seen a lot of kids come through the apprenticeship program, and the ones who made it weren't always the smartest or most talented. They were the ones who showed up day after day through the hard parts and the boring parts and the parts where you wanted to quit. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. "You got a place to stay tonight?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it. In my rush to get to the interview, I'd operated on autopilot. Go to interview. Worry about everything else later. Deal with the fallout when you have to. I admitted I wasn't sure. Maybe find a motel or something. Figure it out. Ray pulled out his phone and made a call, spoke to someone named Chuck, asked if the spare room at his shop was still available. Apparently, it was. My buddy runs an auto repair place on 7th Street. He's got a room above the garage he uses for storage. But there's a cot and a bathroom. It's not much, but it's free and it's safe. You can crash there while you figure things out. I didn't know what to say. I'd walked into this interview expecting to answer questions about my qualifications, and instead I was being offered a lifeline by someone I'd known for 45 minutes. "Man, I really appreciate that. Thank you." He shrugged. "We look out for our own. Now, I can't make you any promises yet. You've got a second interview with our lead journeyman on Thursday, then a shop walkthrough, then the usual paperwork and drug test. But assuming all that goes smooth, you'd be looking at a start date next Monday." I told him I'd be there. Thursday shook his hand and walked out of that building feeling like maybe things were finally moving in the right direction. Thursday's second interview went well. The lead journeyman was a guy named Hector, quiet and serious, who asked practical questions about my work ethic and what I knew about mechanical systems. The shop walk-through was mostly Ray pointing at equipment and explaining what went where. Drug test came back clean, paperwork got filed, and by Friday afternoon, I had a confirmed start date. Chuck ran a repair shop that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration. Concrete floors stained with decades of oil, bay doors that creaked when you opened them, the permanent smell of motor oil and welding flux baked into every surface. He was a compact guy in his 60s with more tattoos than visible skin and a laugh that sounded like a rusty hinge. "So, you're the kid Ray called about." He looked me up and down, eyes pausing on the bruise. "Nice shiner. Who did you tick off?" "My father." "Yeah, those are the worst ones. Come on, I'll show you the room." The room was exactly as advertised. A cot that had probably been military surplus during the Korean War, a space heater that looked like a fire hazard, a bathroom that was mostly functional if you didn't mind water pressure that went from trickle to fire hose, storage boxes stacked along the walls, a small window that looked out over the alley. It was the best thing I'd ever seen. I crashed there that night, sleeping deeper than I had in years. No footsteps overhead, no passive-aggressive comments at breakfast, no feeling like a guest in my own home. Just silence and the distant sound of traffic. Woke up to about 24 messages from my mother. Didn't read any of them. Deleted the notification without opening a single one. The next morning, Dale helped me get my stuff from my parents' house. I'd called him the night before, explained the situation in broad strokes. He didn't ask a lot of questions, just said he'd pick me up at 7 with his truck, and we'd handle it together. "You sure about this? Once you walk out, that's it." "I've been sure for a while, just needed a push." He nodded. "Sometimes family's the hardest thing to walk away from, even when they're the ones hurting you." My mother was waiting when we arrived. She'd clearly been expecting me to come alone, and Dale's presence threw her off. Hard to play the martyr when there's a witness who isn't buying your act. "Colt, you didn't need to bring anyone. We're family. We can talk about this in private." I walked past her without responding. Dale followed, staying close but quiet. Packing took about 20 minutes. Everything I owned fit in a few boxes and a duffel bag. Clothes, books, some tools I'd bought myself, my laptop. The sum total of 26 years in that house. You'd think it would be more, but you don't accumulate much when you're treated like a temporary guest who overstayed his welcome. I was grabbing my important documents when I noticed the manila envelope was gone. Birth certificate, social security card, truck title, all the stuff you need to prove you exist in the eyes of the government. "Where's my paperwork?" "The envelope that was in this drawer. Your father put it somewhere safe. He'll send it to you once you've calmed down. This is just a phase, Colt. You'll see that soon enough. Family is family." I looked at her for a long moment, realized she actually believed what she was saying, that in her mind I'd come crawling back eventually, and they'd hold those documents hostage until I did. "I'll get replacements." Her face tightened. That wasn't the response she'd expected. She'd expected me to argue, to plead, to give her something to work with. Weston showed up as we were loading the truck. He leaned against the porch railing with that smug expression, arms crossed, watching like he was supervising manual labor beneath his station. Running away. "That's your big move." I closed the tailgate and looked at him, felt Dale tense up beside me, ready to step in if needed. "I spent 26 years cleaning up after you, covering for you, bailing you out." He laughed. "And what? Now you're going to make it on your own? Good luck with that, bro. Consider this my retirement." He didn't have a comeback for that, just stood there with his mouth half open as we drove away. In the side mirror, I watched him shrink until he was just a small figure on a porch. The apprenticeship started Monday, 6 in the morning, showing up at the shop in work boots and ready to learn. Ray partnered me with a journeyman named Hector, a quiet guy in his 30s who'd been doing HVAC for 15 years and had forgotten more than most people ever learn. First day, he looked me over and said one thing, "You going to show up every day?" "Yes, sir." "Then we'll get along fine." Hector wasn't a talker. He taught by doing, expected you to watch and absorb, and only explained things once. If you weren't paying attention, that was your problem. He didn't hold grudges, but he didn't hold hands either. You either kept up or you didn't. The first few weeks were brutal. Up before dawn, working until my muscles screamed, studying for certifications at night in Chuck's storage room. I lived on gas station coffee and cheap groceries, lost about 15, gained calluses on calluses, and learned more about air handling units than I ever thought possible. The room above Chuck's garage became my home. I cleaned out the storage boxes, put up some cheap shelves, and hung a blanket over the window for privacy. Chuck started letting me use the shop equipment after hours to work on my truck, teaching me engine repair basics in exchange for helping him close up at night. He'd been a Marine back in the day, done 2 tours, came home and built this shop from nothing. One evening, about 3 weeks in, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a set of keys and the title to an old work van that had been sitting in the corner of his lot for years. "What's this?" "Keys to that van out back. She runs fine. Just needs some cosmetic work." "I can't take this. At least let me pay you something." He waved me off. "You've been helping me close up every night, never asked for nothing. Call it a long-term loan. Pay it forward someday when you're in a position to help some other kid who needs a break." That van became my lifeline. Reliable transportation, something I could use for work, a backup shelter if everything else fell apart. I worked on it every spare moment, fixing things, cleaning out years of accumulated junk. About a month after I'd walked out, I got my first real paycheck from Garrett Mechanical, $846 after taxes. Not much by most standards, but to me, it was proof that I could survive without my family. That same week, I tried to open a bank account, got declined. The bank flagged my info, said I had negative reports tied to my SSN, and they couldn't open anything in-house. Recommended I pull my credit report and figure out what was going on. I requested a credit report. What came back made everything else look like a warm-up act. 3 credit cards I'd never applied for, a car loan for a vehicle I'd never seen, store accounts at places I'd never shopped, monthly subscriptions to services I'd never heard of, a personal line of credit that had been maxed out and barely maintained, total debt just over $32,000. I sat at the counter in Chuck's garage staring at those numbers until they stopped making sense. 32 grand. That was more than I'd made in most years. That was the difference between getting by and getting ahead. That was my future stolen piece by piece while I was too busy surviving to notice. The charges told the story. Gaming equipment that matched Weston's setup, expensive clothes, gas station purchases, regular as clockwork every few days, monthly payments on what looked like business software that probably tied to my father's company tools, and equipment from suppliers I'd never heard of. There was even a gym membership. I'd never set foot in a gym in my life, but apparently I'd been a member for 3 years. The smoking gun was buried in the account statements. One of the credit cards had been used for an online order, some gaming headset that cost $400. The shipping confirmation was in the documents Lucy helped me pull later, delivered to Weston's name at my parents' address. My name on the card, his name on the package. He knew exactly where the money was coming from. The oldest account dated back to when I was 19. They'd been doing this for 7 years. 7 years of building debt in my name, making minimum payments to keep the accounts active, using me as their personal credit line while telling me to my face that the family couldn't afford to help me get ahead. I thought about all the times I'd asked for help, the certification courses I couldn't afford, the trade school applications I never submitted because the fees were too high, the better apartments I couldn't qualify for because I had no credit history. Turned out I had plenty of credit history. It just wasn't mine. My parents had built their whole financial house of cards on my social security number. I was the foundation they'd never told me about. I took the credit report to a lawyer. Couldn't afford a good one, but there was a legal aid clinic downtown that handled cases like mine for reduced rates. The woman I met with, Lucy, had been doing this for 20 years and had seen everything the Permian Basin could throw at her. Family identity theft is more common than people think. Unfortunately, it's also harder to prosecute because victims don't want to press charges against relatives. I'm not one of those victims. She looked at me for a long moment. Good. Then let's talk about your options. The options were straightforward. I could try to resolve it privately, which meant confronting my parents and hoping they'd agree to take responsibility. Fat chance. Or I could file a formal identity theft report with the police and credit bureaus, which would launch an investigation and likely result in criminal charges. You know what happens if we go the legal route? Your father could end up in prison. Your mother could face charges too. I know. And you're okay with that? They had 26 years to treat me like family. They chose this instead. File the report. Lucy nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. The investigation moved slowly. Weeks of paperwork, interviews, subpoenas. By the time the fraud unit finished pulling records, about 4 months had passed. But once they started connecting dots, the whole thing fell apart. My father's landscaping business had been losing money for years while he maintained the facade of success. He'd been covering the shortfall through a combination of credit fraud, unreported income, and creative invoicing that crossed the line into outright theft from clients. Turned out the identity theft wasn't limited to me. The investigators found similar patterns with a couple of distant relatives and at least 2 former employees who'd had accounts opened in their names. One of the employees was a guy who'd worked for my father for about 6 months before quitting. He'd been dealing with mysterious credit issues for years and never figured out where they came from. The investigators connected those dots pretty quick once they started looking, but the identity theft was just the surface. The real damage was in the business records. My father had been collecting deposits from clients for landscaping jobs, sometimes $10,000 or $15,000 for big commercial contracts, then using that money to cover personal expenses instead of buying materials. He'd string clients along for months, do partial work, then disappear when they started asking questions. The prosecutor eventually tallied up about $80,000 in client deposits that never went to actual jobs. On top of that, the IRS got involved. Turns out he'd been underreporting income for years, paying workers under the table to avoid payroll taxes, and writing off personal expenses as business costs. The tax liability alone was close to $40,000 once they added penalties and interest. My mother had been in on it from the start. Her signature was on half the documents. Her email address was linked to the accounts. She couldn't claim ignorance because she'd been managing everything herself, including the ones in my name. Every month she'd logged in, made payments, checked balances, and moved money around. The first real consequence hit about 6 weeks after I filed the report. A detective showed up at my father's job site asking questions in front of his clients. Word travels stupid fast in work circles out here, and news of an investigation spreads even faster. Within a month, his business had dried up completely. Nobody wanted to hire a guy who was under investigation for fraud. My mother tried to reach me. I didn't respond. Whatever she had to say, I'd heard it all before. The guilt trips, the accusations, the rewritten history where they were the victims, and I was the ungrateful son who destroyed everything. Weston was even more predictable. He showed up at Chuck's garage one afternoon, driving that expensive truck of his, clearly expecting some kind of confrontation. I was in the back when I heard his voice. I know he's here. Tell him to come out and face me like a man. Chuck met him at the door with a tire iron in one hand and a look that said he knew exactly how to use it and wasn't against demonstrating. You're going to want to get back in that pretty truck and drive away. Or what? You're going to hit me? I'll sue this whole place into the ground. Son, I've been in enough bad situations to know you don't want this one. Get off my property. Weston left, peeled out of the parking lot like a teenager trying to look tough. Chuck watched him go, then turned to me. Your brother seems like a real winner. Ray pulled me aside after work a few days later. He'd heard about the situation through the small-town grapevine. Word had gotten around that the new apprentice was the one who'd blown the whistle on his own family. You holding up okay? I'm working on it. He nodded. Family stuff is always the hardest, but you did the right thing. People who will steal from their own kid won't stop until someone stops them. They just find new victims. The fallout was messy. My father got charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, evasion. The prosecutor had enough evidence to bury him, and once the paper trail was laid out, he finally took a plea instead of getting destroyed at trial. The sentencing hearing came about 8 months after he took the plea. Lucy had prepared me for what to expect, walked me through the process, helped me understand what would be asked, but seeing it play out in person was different, harder than I thought it would be. My mother crying on the stand like she was the victim, talking about how hard their lives had been. She made eye contact with me exactly once, and I saw nothing that looked like remorse. Weston refusing to speak at all, sitting in the gallery looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, occasionally checking his phone until the judge told him to put it away. My father's attorney trying every angle for a lighter sentence, painting me as a vindictive son with a grudge, suggesting the crimes were exaggerated, implying I was mentally unstable. None of it moved the judge. The documentation was too solid. The pattern was too obvious for anyone to ignore. I gave a victim impact statement, told the truth. Every hidden opportunity, every sabotage chance, every dollar they'd stolen while telling me to my face that the family couldn't afford to help. The prosecutor had documentation for all of it, bank records, account statements, the timeline of purchases, credit card applications with forged signatures, emails between my parents discussing how to manage the accounts without me finding out, and that shipping confirmation with Weston's name on the package, paid for with a card in my name. That one got a reaction from the courtroom. The final tally was ugly. 32 grand in my name alone, plus another 15 across the other victims once they widened the scope. 80,000 in stolen client deposits, 40,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. My father had built a nearly $170,000 hole using other people's money and trust, and now it was time to pay up. My father got 4 years state time. My mother got probation and community service, plus a court order to repay the debts they'd run up in my name. Restitution from assets, which meant the house. As they let him out, my father looked at me one last time. "You happy now? You destroyed this family." I didn't blink. "No, you did. I just stopped helping you hide it." The house got forced into a sale to cover what they owed. When my mother couldn't keep up with anything on her own, foreclosure followed a few months later. The place I'd grown up in, gone to pay for the damage they'd done. Weston somehow avoided direct charges. He'd been careful enough or lucky enough not to have his name on anything directly incriminating, but his free ride was over. No more parental subsidies, no more education fund, no more expensive truck, which got repossessed when the payments stopped because it turned out those payments had been coming from the fraudulent accounts. Last I heard, he was working at a gas station and living with Kennedy's family, which I'm sure was exactly the future he'd always pictured for himself. Real entrepreneurial. The money side took longer to sort out. The fraudulent accounts got closed, the debts got disputed. My credit report got cleaned up piece by piece over the course of about a year. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy. I spent hours on the phone with credit bureaus, filled out enough paperwork to build a small house, and learned more about the dispute process than anyone should have to. But by the end of it, my score had climbed back to something functional. I stayed at Chuck's place for about 8 months before finding a studio apartment of my own. Small, cheap, but it was mine, paid for with money I earned. The apprenticeship led to a real position. Journeyman certification came through after about 2 years of grinding through courses and exams and practical hours. Ray promoted me to crew lead not long after that, which meant a raise and actual responsibility, and people who looked to me for answers. Hector gave me a nod when he heard the news, which from him was basically a standing ovation. Dale and I stayed tight. He came to my certification ceremony, stood in the back with Chuck, both of them looking like proud uncles at a graduation. We grabbed dinner afterward at a taco truck that Dale swore was the best in the Permian Basin. He wasn't wrong. Best carnitas I've ever had, served on paper plates in a parking lot. Chuck eventually sold me that work van outright, refused to take full price, said I'd already paid for it in sweat equity from all the nights I'd helped close up the shop. I still drive it, still runs fine. Probably will outlast me at this rate. My mother reached once about a year after everything settled. A letter handwritten, full of the kind of language that sounds like an apology, but never actually admits to anything. A lot of, "We never meant for things to turn out this way," and "I hope you can find it in your heart." I read it once, then threw it away. Some doors are better left closed. I never heard from my father directly, probably for the best. I don't know what I'd say to him anyway. Maybe nothing. Maybe just walk away. Same as I did that morning when he made his position clear. His future matters, yours never did. Funny thing is, he was right. To him, my future never did matter. I was just a resource to be used, a convenient tool for building the life he wanted for himself and his favorite son. But that stopped being his call the moment I walked out that door. If you're reading this and something feels familiar, I want you to know that walking away isn't quitting. Sometimes it's the only way to start actually living.